What happens when a burned chair, a forgotten keycard, and a child's testimony bring down one of the most powerful judges in America? This isn't a movie. It's not fiction. It's a real confrontation where truth walks in without permission, and silence finally shatters under the weight of one woman's courage. Karoline Leavitt didn't come to defend herself. She came so a dead man could speak, and a nation would finally listen. If you believe the truth should never be buried behind power, like, subscribe, and share this video. Drop a comment below with one word, listen. Because justice doesn't start in courtrooms, it starts with us. Be part of this story. Be part of this moment. And don't miss the next chapter. We're just getting started. They thought they'd buried the story beneath miles of red tape and concrete, deep in the Arizona desert, where a nuclear power facility had been quietly leaking radiation for months. But what began as whispers inside maintenance tunnels had now reached a federal courtroom in Washington, D.C. It was a cold Monday morning. No press, no gallery, no public live stream. Only security-cleared officials, a 7-member federal review board, and one unexpected name on the docket: Karoline Leavitt, former White House press secretary, just 27 years old. She wasn't accused of anything. Not yet. But the air said otherwise. The case had nothing to do with her until it suddenly had everything to do with her. And presiding over it all was Supreme Court Justice Clarence Thomas, acting not as a judge, but as special oversight authority. He sat high above the room, flanked by Department of Energy officials and federal legal counsel. His presence alone said this was no ordinary hearing. It wasn't about law. It was about containment. Karoline entered quietly. No suit, no aides, no legal team, just a plain gray blouse and a canvas shoulder bag. She didn't greet anyone. She didn't look around. She didn't blink when Thomas leaned into his mic and delivered the order that would change everything. This court will not tolerate conspiracy disguised as patriotism, he declared. Effective immediately. Karoline Leavitt is under a formal gag order. She is not to speak, submit, or reference any internal data related to the 2 containment breach at Sonora Ridge Nuclear Facility, nor its after-action reports. A subtle gasp stirred from one of the board members, quickly stifled by protocol. But Karoline didn't flinch. She walked to her assigned seat, nodded once, and gently set the canvas bag down beside her chair. Her fingers lingered on the zipper, but she didn't open it. Not yet. The room fell into a strange kind of stillness. Not quiet, not loud. Just tension, like everyone was waiting for someone else to move first. But Karoline didn't give them that satisfaction. She folded her hands calmly on the desk and looked straight ahead as if nothing had just happened. Justice Thomas cleared his throat. "Ms. Leavitt, do you understand the terms of this restriction?" Karoline remained silent. A security officer stepped forward slightly. Thomas raised a hand to stop him. "You are a private citizen. Now," he continued, "this is not a press conference. If you violate this order, federal contempt will follow." Still, she said nothing. Instead, her hand reached down slowly to the side of the chair, resting on that simple gray bag. It wasn't designer. It wasn't branded. It was the kind of bag a high school teacher might carry into an after-hours faculty meeting. Worn, scuffed, dependable. Her silence was louder than anything she could have said. From the far end of the room, a Department of Energy lawyer leaned in and whispered to a colleague. "She's bluffing. She has nothing. It's performative." But the lawyer beside him didn't answer. His eyes were fixed on the bag. Because something about the way she placed it, deliberate, unhurried, and without defiance, didn't read like theater. It read like someone who knew exactly what she was doing, and more importantly, when to do it. Thomas sat back, stone-faced. "This court will reconvene at 0900 tomorrow," he announced. "Until then, the record is sealed." He struck the gavel once, hard. But what no one noticed, at least not yet, was that Karoline never left the bag, unattended. When she rose to exit, she didn't sling it over her shoulder. She cradled it in both hands, like someone carrying something precious, like someone holding evidence that wasn't supposed to exist. And the silence, it was only beginning. The next morning, the hearing resumed. No media, no live stream. Just the same narrow room, same paneled walls, same stone-faced board. But this time, Karoline Levitt walked in, holding the gray canvas bag a little differently, not tucked discreetly at her side like yesterday. Today, it was gripped in front of her with both hands like something sacred. Justice Clarence Thomas entered his robe stiff, and his voice clipped. "Ms. Levitt, this is not a criminal proceeding. You are not on trial, but any further violation of this court's order will result in immediate removal." Karoline didn't respond. She simply stepped to the table, placed the bag gently on the surface, unzipped it, slow, steady, and drew out two objects. One, a death certificate. The other, a single sheet of paper, creased, faded, hand-sketched in graphite. She held both in the light. "This," she said evenly, "is the story of a man no one in this room has ever met, and no one ever tried to save." His name was Eli Wade. He was a technician at the Sonora Ridge nuclear facility for 19 years. He lived in a town no one talks about, near a leak no one ever fixed. The room stayed silent. One board member blinked slowly, as if just now realizing she wasn't bluffing. Another shifted in his seat, arms crossing. Karoline continued, voice calm, but unrelenting. 3 months before he died of acute myeloid leukemia, Eli sent this hand-drawn sketch to the Department of Energy. It shows a fault in the backup cooling valve, Zone 3, Section 6A. He said the radioactive steam was collecting behind a failing gasket. He labeled it in pencil. "High risk of internal vapor breach. Days, not weeks." She held the paper out. No one took it. He emailed it twice. No response. He called the emergency desk. No callback. 4 days later, the radiation alert system in that zone went offline. A week after that, his security badge was revoked. No explanation. Just silence. One of the federal officials finally broke in, his tone clinical. "Ms. Levitt, with respect, this is not admissible evidence. You're introducing hearsay personal items and undocumented allegations." Karoline turned to him. Not a hint of anger in her face. Just the kind of quiet clarity that makes powerful men suddenly uncomfortable. "Not admissible," she said. "Then, what is a lab report that never got filed? An email chain that got scrubbed from the server? A human being who died in silence, does that not count? If this man's death isn't admissible, then maybe what's on trial here isn't just me. Maybe it's all of you." You could hear the breath catch in the room. One board member looked down at his lap, pretending to write something. But his pen never moved. She laid the death certificate down on the table. Clean white paper. Cause of death, radiation-induced leukemia. Place of death, Yuma General Hospital. Time of death, 10 a.m. No obituary. No federal investigation. Just a number. He lived 5 miles from the plant, she said. Same water supply, same air. He never smoked a cigarette, never missed a day of work. He told his wife, "If anything happens to me, promise me someone will ask why." And then he was gone. Justice Thomas said nothing. His hands were clasped tightly in front of him, but his knuckles had turned white. "You don't have to believe me," Karoline said, voice lower now. "You don't even have to care. But that sketch he made? It's the same section where the coolant failure was detected 2 weeks after he died. That wasn't a coincidence. It was a warning, and it was ignored." Someone in the back cleared their throat uncomfortably. She held the paper up again. "This isn't a conspiracy. This is a dead man's fingerprint left on the edge of a failing system." A beat of silence. Then she asked the question no one wanted her to ask. If this doesn't belong in the record, where does it belong? The room froze. Even the guards near the wall seemed unsure of where to look. She gathered the papers, stepped forward, and placed them on the evidence tray. Not gently, not dramatically, deliberately. And then she said quietly, "Clearly, I didn't come here to speak because I enjoy confrontation. I came because Eli Wade can't, and because someone has to." Then she sat back down, hands folded. No speeches, no appeals. Just the weight of truth now sitting on the record, whether anyone liked it or not. Justice Thomas adjusted his glasses. For the first time since the hearing began, he didn't look at Karoline. He looked at the death certificate. And for the first time, he blinked. The room was still reeling from the death certificate. Some board members had dropped their pens. Others leaned back, suddenly quiet. Karoline didn't speak again right away. She let the silence settle, let the weight of Eli Wade's name sink in like a stone at the bottom of a river. Then, deliberately, she reached into the gray canvas bag one final time. What came out next was not a document, not a device, not evidence, as the court understood it. It was a wooden box. Small, time-worn edges scuffed and softened by years. The kind of box a man might keep on a garage shelf next to his work gloves. A box that held what mattered. Scratched across the top in faded black ink were 2 simple initials, E. Wade. Karoline didn't speak immediately. She placed the box in the center of the table, unlatched it without flourish, and opened the lid. Inside 2 items. First, a handwritten letter folded and carefully bound with a blue elastic band. Second, a shard of broken glass roughly the size of a matchbox, its surface still bearing smudged fingerprints, and one haunting phrase painted in red marker radiation leak, "Storage valve 6A. Do not ignore." The marker had bled slightly into the glass, but the message was unmistakable. It was a warning. Karoline picked up the letter. Her hands didn't shake. Her voice didn't rise. She simply began to read the words, pulling the oxygen out of the room, 1 sentence at a time. To whoever finds this. "My name is Rachel Wade. My husband Eli died from radiation exposure, working at Sonora Ridge. He came home one night shaking, not scared, angry. He said, 'They told me to stop asking questions. They said if I keep pushing I'd lose my clearance, then my job, and then, maybe worse.'" Karoline paused for a moment. Nobody moved. Even Clarence Thomas, once stone-faced and silent, was now gripping his pen so tightly that his knuckles had turned pale. He didn't stop. He said, "If anything happens to me, find someone who still believes truth matters more than headlines." I found her. The courtroom felt like it had lost air pressure. One board member rubbed his forehead. Another sat with her arms wrapped tightly across her chest. Even the guard by the exit seemed to blink slower than before. Karoline set the letter down. Then she lifted the shard of glass with 2 fingers and turned it toward the panel. The red writing caught the ceiling lights. For a brief moment it glowed like a silent flare. "This was found under his workbench," she said plainly. Eli had labeled it himself after removing it from a cracked radiation gauge. He kept it hidden, afraid it might disappear, like the rest of his warnings. She gently laid it back in the box, closed the lid, and rested both hands on top of it. I'm not asking you to treat this as evidence. I'm asking you to treat it as truth. The kind of truth a dying man tried to preserve. The kind his wife couldn't bury without a witness. Justice Thomas leaned forward slightly, but said nothing. He looked at the box, not Karoline. Not the letter. Just the box, like it might open itself and tell him something he didn't want to hear. He didn't ask for a monument, Karoline added. He asked for someone who wouldn't look away. A hush fell across the room deeper than before. This wasn't silence from protocol. It was the kind of silence that comes when everyone is wondering what they've failed to do. Then came the line, soft, clear, but unforgettable. If a man's warnings are erased and his wife's letter ignored, then what is this court protecting, truth or reputation? No one answered. Karoline didn't press. She didn't repeat herself. Instead, she placed the wooden box back inside her canvas bag, zipped it up, and sat down. The room remained quiet, except for the faint hum of the ceiling vent and the ticking of an analog clock on the wall. Clarence Thomas finally shifted. He uncrossed his hands slowly, set his pen down, and glanced toward the exit, just for a moment. But the message had landed, not with fireworks, not with spectacle, with something more dangerous, with conscience. The room hadn't moved since the widow's letter was read. Not a whisper, not a cough, just the low hum of tension rising with every second. Karoline stayed silent. But then she stood up again, this time without a word, and walked to the rear of the chamber. For a moment, it looked like she was leaving. Even the guards tensed, unsure whether to stop her. But Karoline didn't leave. She rolled something in behind her. Wood scraping tile. A sound so ordinary. And yet in this setting it pierced the room like a fire alarm. It was a chair. But not just any chair. This one was old, visibly worn, and partially charred on its back leg, blackened and splintered from heat. The fabric on the seat was frayed with a dark stain that time hadn't fully erased. The metal frame creaked under the lightest touch. She pulled it into the center of the courtroom, turned it outward so the panel could see it clearly, and then stepped back. Not dramatically, not mournfully, just purposefully. Then she spoke. One line. Eli sat on this every night before walking into the storage room that no one wants to talk about. The effect was immediate. One board member whispered, "Is that real?" Another leaned forward, eyes narrowing. Clarence Thomas didn't speak. He simply stared at the chair, as if unsure whether it was a relic or a weapon. Karoline didn't touch the chair again. She didn't explain the burn. She didn't narrate how she got it. She just left it there, silent, scorched, undeniable. That's when a voice broke the stillness. A councilwoman near the center of the bench leaned toward her colleague and muttered, "Where did she even get that chair?" Karoline heard it. She turned her head slightly, but didn't smile. Instead, she answered with something cleaner than emotion, sharper than protest. From someone who didn't have the power to speak, but still left behind a voice. No one in the room knew what to do with that. Because in a world of redacted memos and sealed transcripts, a burned chair wasn't just inconvenient. It was undeniable. The longer it sat there, the louder it seemed to speak. This wasn't data. This wasn't evidence buried in legal terms or debated in technical language. This was a man's place in the world, and it had been literally scarred by the job he died doing. You could see it on the faces of the board. The chair was harder to ignore than a file. It wasn't theory. It wasn't hearsay. It was proof you could feel with your own hands. Karoline let it breathe for a few seconds more. Then, she turned back to the panel and said softly, "He knew what that room was doing to him, but he sat on this anyway, night after night, because he believed doing the right thing was worth the risk." She didn't elaborate. She didn't raise her voice. She simply walked back to her seat, passing the chair as if passing a flag folded on a military casket. And the chair stayed where it was, alone in the center of the courtroom, burned, unmoved, testifying without saying a word. The chair still sat in the middle of the courtroom, like a ghost that refused to leave. Scorched, silent, and immovable, it said more than any cross-examination ever could. And just when the room thought it had absorbed everything Karoline Levitt had brought to light, the door opened, not from the back, but from the side. The secure entry. The guards didn't stop him. They'd been told in advance. A young boy, 14 years old, lean frame, navy blue polo shirt tucked into khakis, stepped inside. In his hand, he clutched something tightly wrapped in a cloth. His steps were hesitant but determined. Micah Wade, the son of the technician, the child of the ghost. Gasps didn't echo, but glances flew fast. Some leaned in. Others sat up straighter, unsure if this was appropriate, if this was even legal. But Karoline stood and motioned gently. Micah walked past the burned chair, pausing briefly to glance at it not as a spectacle, but as something he remembered. He took his place beside Karoline. She bent slightly, whispered something we couldn't hear. Then she stepped back. And Micah spoke. His voice wasn't loud, but it was clear. The words weren't perfect, but the truth in them needed no editing. I was in the control room that night. My dad let me stay late, said it was a quiet shift. I sat on a bench in the corner, drawing space shuttles in my notebook. He didn't know I was watching. Silence. At 9:32 p.m., I heard him yell at someone. One of the supervisors. He was pointing at a screen. I remember him saying the words, "Shut it down now," over and over. He looked up from the paper he held in his trembling hands. No one listened. The other man told him he didn't have authority. My dad said, "I'm not asking permission. I'm begging you to save lives." You could feel the air shift. Even Clarence Thomas, still gripping the edge of his bench, wiped sweat from his brow. Karoline stepped forward, knelt slightly beside Micah. "What did your father say when he left the house that morning?" Micah's voice cracked, but he didn't pause. He said, "If I don't come home tonight, don't ever stop asking why." The weight of that sentence didn't just land, it shattered something unspoken in the room. Micah held up the cloth in his hand and slowly unwrapped it. Inside, a steel key card, worn faded with time, cracked at the corner. This was his access badge. I found it under his pillow after he died. My mom didn't know. He must have left it there on purpose. It still smells like his work boots. There wasn't a dry eye on the front row anymore. One board member, a man who hadn't looked up once during the hearing, removed his glasses and rubbed his temples like someone waking up from a long, uncomfortable sleep. Karoline didn't push. She didn't embellish. She let the room feel it. Then she rose slowly and said, "This young man witnessed what none of us did. Not in a report, not in a debrief, in real time, with real consequences." She turned toward the bench. "There are some things no hearing can erase, no ruling can redact. What this boy saw and what his father tried to prevent are among them." Clarence Thomas didn't speak, but his eyes no longer bore that glassy confidence. He stared not at Micah, but at the burned chair. Karoline finished softly. A man gave his life trying to stop a silent disaster. A wife kept his words alive. A son carried the memory none of us wanted to believe. And now the court has to decide whether to bury them again, or finally listen. Micah stepped back, set the access card beside the chair, his father's last trace, then sat beside Karoline without a sound. No gavel struck, no ruling came, just stillness. And in that stillness, a boy had done what no headline could make the room remember what truth feels like when it speaks through a child. The silence after Micah Wade spoke wasn't just stillness, it was stunned paralysis. A boy had testified to what he saw with his own eyes. A key card from his father lay beside the burned chair. The courtroom had already been shaken by a death certificate, a widow's letter, and a hand-painted warning on broken glass. Every piece told a story no one in power wanted told. But Karoline Levitt wasn't finished. She reached into her gray bag one last time and removed a small silver hard drive. No label, no fanfare, just brushed metal about the size of a pack of gum. Without a word, she handed it to the court technician. A few clicks, a pause. Then, the speakers crackled. At first, only ambient background noise, papers shuffling, faint typing, muffled footsteps. Then, a voice, sharp, commanding, unmistakably corporate. If anyone leaks this, especially Wade, send legal. We don't stop the plant. It's cheaper if someone dies than if we shut it down. The room froze. Again. It wasn't a guess. It wasn't a paraphrase. It was a recorded confession. A member of the board dropped their pen. Someone in the gallery gasped audibly. Clarence Thomas, motionless until that moment, tightened his grip on the armrest so hard the wood creaked under his hand. But it wasn't over. The audio continued. The voice lowered, conspiratorial. Thomas signed off on it. The judiciary will protect us. No one moved. Karoline stepped forward, gaze now firmly locked on Clarence Thomas himself. Her voice wasn't angry. It was deliberate, cold, and devastating. You once said, truth needs process. But let's be honest. Your Honor, process is what let Eli Wade die. You could have heard a pin drop on carpet. The room wasn't just listening, it was holding its breath. When a man warned of a leak, your system filed it away. When a boy watched his father plead for action, your system dismissed him. And when a company chose death over cost, your signature let them believe they'd never be held accountable. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Because in that moment, the courtroom wasn't hearing Karoline speak. It was hearing the truth roar. The recording ended with a click, but the silence that followed didn't feel like stillness anymore. It felt like the eye of a storm. The moment before collapse. Clarence Thomas didn't speak, but for the first time since the hearing began, he looked shaken. Not angry, not dismissive, just exposed. Karoline placed the silver drive gently next to the burned chair and said, "You don't have to explain." The tape already did, and just like that, the illusion of control shattered. The court, the board, the walls that had contained decades of silence all felt like they were collapsing inward. No ruling had been made, but everyone knew. Something had just shifted, and it wasn't going back. No gavel was struck. No motion was passed. No official ruling declared. But the verdict had already arrived, and you could feel it in the air. After the audio played, after the board heard a corporate executive say, "It's cheaper if someone dies." And after the name Clarence Thomas was linked to that cold, unfiltered admission, the courtroom stopped functioning as a courtroom. It became something else, a reckoning. Karoline Levitt didn't gloat. She didn't look around for validation. She simply returned to her seat, calm composed her gray canvas bag, now half open, the silver drive still resting near the scorched chair. The room waited for Thomas to speak, to deny, to redirect, to command. But he didn't. Instead, after a long, suffocating silence, Justice Clarence Thomas slowly rose from his chair. He did not look at Karoline. He did not look at Micah. He did not look at the burned chair still in the center of the room. He looked down at his own hands briefly, then at the floor, and without a word, he stepped back from the bench and walked out. The side door closed behind him with a soft but final click. No one followed. No one clapped. No one even breathed. Because when a man in power walks away without defending himself, that silence is louder than any speech. Exactly 1 hour later, a press release went out first as an email from the U.S. Supreme Court's Public Information Office, then picked up across national wires. Justice Clarence Thomas has voluntarily recused himself from all future federal-level energy-related judicial proceedings. No interview, no apology. Just one bureaucratic line trying to put out a fire that had already reached the roof. But no memo could erase what the country had just seen. No recusal could unhear that recording. And no procedural sidestep could rebuild the trust that collapsed in that room. Karoline didn't celebrate. There was no fist pump, no gotcha moment. She simply stood, walked to the center of the room, where the chair remained, and knelt beside it. Micah and his mother Rachel watched from the side. Karoline reached into her bag and pulled out the wooden box, the one with the initials E. Wade still etched into the lid. She held it with both hands. Rose slowly and approached the boy. Then gently with reverence, she handed the box to Micah. "He didn't die unknown," she said. "He died speaking. And now, the country is listening." Micah nodded. He didn't say anything. He just looked down at the box, his fingers brushing the lid, like it held not just memory, but meaning. Karoline turned to Rachel, the widow, who had written the letter that shattered the court's indifference. They didn't hug. They didn't pose. They just locked eyes in a silent agreement that something had finally broken open. Not just a case, but a culture of silence. No court order would ever fix what had been lost. But in that moment, in that room, truth had been heard. And not because someone shouted it, but because a woman carried it. A mother wrote it. A child remembered it. And a burned chair refused to be ignored. In a world that often rewards silence and punishes truth, this story reminds us of something timeless. One voice, steady and brave, can still shake the walls of power. Karoline Leavitt didn't carry a title or an army. She carried a letter, a chair, a child's memory, and with that, she restored dignity to a man the system tried to erase. As Americans who've lived through decades of change, Watergate, Vietnam, 9/11, we know that justice doesn't always come from institutions. Sometimes it comes from ordinary people refusing to look away. Whether you're a parent, grandparent, or veteran, you understand the value of speaking up when it matters most. This story is not just about exposing corruption. It's about remembering the people who never got to speak and honoring them by refusing to stay silent. In your own life, that might mean asking harder questions, listening more deeply, or simply standing by someone who dares to tell the truth. If this story moved you, comment below with "I remember." Subscribe to our channel to follow more stories that honor truth, courage, and the American spirit. Because the next voice that changes everything might be yours.